For Israelis near the Gaza border, a missile could come at any moment. This has been the reality of Adele Raymer's life for the last decade at her home in Kibbutz Nirim, just 2 kilometers from the border fence.
Every time a rocket explodes, every time there's a red alert, people run for their lives, and that affects you. As a person who lives here, I have to have optimism.
But while the Israeli Defense Forces are tasked with stopping these attacks, Raymer also feels left in the dark about the security situation.
When there are ceasefires here, the government doesn't say there's a ceasefire. We hear that there's a ceasefire because it's announced from the other side. We're having rockets exploding over our heads. We need to know what's happening.
This confusion is in part because the IDF isn't the only one preventing attacks. The Hamas government in Gaza also uses its own restraining force to stop missile attacks and infiltrations by non-Hamas militants.
There was a lot of noise here last night, a lot of explosions, and from what I understood, unofficially, there was an attempted infiltration, and they stopped it on the other side because the Hamas promised to keep the violence down because they want the money to continue coming in.
This money, which is supplied by Qatar through Israel, is part of the indirect negotiations that Hamas enters into with Israel, using Qatar and Egypt as mediators to keep the calm. Usually, after an attack or disagreement, when Israel cuts the flow of fuel and money into Gaza, Hamas stops restraining violence on the border to put pressure on Israel. But now, Hamas is trying a new strategy, according to a Gaza analyst, Asoka, who asked that we not use her real name.
Hamas needs to end economic crisis, political crisis, and also this, he wants to confirm from the Palestinian people that we are want to have a solution for the problems here in Gaza, even if we success the truce with Israel by indirect negotiation with Israel. Maybe Hamas is studying the situation, the internal Israeli situation nowadays, especially the elections.
Leading up to the September 17th election in Israel, the government appears hesitant to take harsh steps against Hamas. Former IDF Major General Itan Dengo calls this an Israeli mistake that gives Hamas the upper hand in current negotiations.
The present government before the election is one of the weak points that Hamas identify on their demands towards Israel.
Dengo says Hamas has been forced into more negotiations with Israel since the Egyptians cut off the southern border of Gaza.
It's the only place in the Middle East today that the terror organization as an entity is controlling 2 million people. Hamas is not willing to give something for real improvement of the life of people. And they know in Israel there is elections, we will push the Israeli present government towards the wall till we will get everything.
As Hamas pushes for concessions from Israel before the election, it appears to be using its restraining forces to prevent any escalation that would sour the negotiations. Still, several rocket attacks and border infiltrations have been carried out in the last 2 weeks by non-Hamas militants, including 4 heavily armed fighters crossing the border before being killed by the IDF. On the Israeli side, many residents of the south feel neglected by the government's current stance on Hamas.
Netanyahu has been very, very strong in his words. His actions, not so much. The prime minister would probably lose a lot of his popularity if he really did speak to the Hamas. So we're sort of political pawns.
Although there is no official direct communication between Israel and Hamas, many seem to think that Hamas's success at restraining attacks may lead to some sort of security cooperation. The head of security for the kibbutzim in the region, Itan Isaacson, disagrees.
At the moment, they think it's good to restrain for themselves. And in a week's time, when they want to, when they decide to fire or do some kind of activities, they'll do it. It's just a game. It doesn't affect us.
It remains to be seen what Hamas will gain from this current policy of restraint and how the Israeli response may change after the elections.